Hey folks, I'm your friend here. Pull up a blanket and get comfortable, because tonight I'm gonna tell you the mystery of the West. Not the cowboy version, not the cartoon version, the real one. The one about the giant with the frozen mother, the lonely blue ox, and a secret carved into the Grand Canyon that they never put in the storybooks. You think you know Paul Bunyan? You don't. Not yet. Close your eyes for a second. It's winter, but not the cute winter where you sip hot cocoa and complain about your heating bill. I'm talking about the kind of winter where your spit freezes before it hits the ground. The kind where wolves look at you like your dinner and the trees themselves seem to hate you. Now imagine you're living in a logging camp. You haven't seen the sun in 11 weeks. Your beard has icicles the size of your fingers, and you just heard a sound in the distance. Thump, thump, thump. That's not an earthquake, my friend. That's footsteps. And whatever is making those footsteps is heading straight for your bunk. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of the man who accidentally carved the Grand Canyon because he dragged his axe one time. So here's what you're gonna do. Turn off the TV. Put the phone face down unless you want to see something that ruins your sleep. Get under that blanket, pull it up to your chin, and let your eyes get heavy. Because tonight, America, we're talking about Paul Bunyan, the giant with the blue ox, the hero who wasn't really a hero, and the lonely, frozen, heartbreaking truth they don't put in the picture books. Hey there, it's late, I know. Maybe you had a long day at work. Maybe the kids were crazy. Maybe you're just lying there staring at the ceiling, wondering why you texted your ex earlier. No judgment. That's what this is for. My voice. The Dark. A story about a man so big he made mountains jealous, and so lonely he invented an entire continent just to feel like he belonged somewhere. So take a breath, let it out slow, and let's go back, like before America had maps, before anybody knew what a state was, back when the only thing between the Atlantic and the Pacific was a whole lot of trees, a whole lot of snow, and a whole lot of nothing trying to kill you. That's where Paul Bunyan was born. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, Paul Bunyan, big guy, blue ox, cute story for the kids. No, 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 no. Paul Bunyan was not cute. Paul Bunyan was terrifying, not because he was mean, he wasn't. Paul was actually, and I mean this sincerely, one of the gentlest giants you could ever hope not to run into in the dark. But gentleness doesn't matter when you weigh 40 tons and you sneeze so hard you create a tornado. Let me start at the beginning. Most babies are born in hospitals, or, beds, with doctors and blankets and tiny little hats. Paul Bunyan was born on the coast of Maine, which back then was basically just rocks and pine trees and angry lobsters. His parents were normal-sized people, regular folks, farmers, I think, maybe loggers. Nobody really knows for sure. What we know is that when Mrs. Bunyan went into labor, the midwife took one look at the situation and ran. Not walked. Ran. Because Paul came out already the size of a 3-year-old, and he was still growing. By the time he was 1 week old, he was the size of a horse. By the time he was 1 month old, he was the size of a barn. And by the time he was 6 months old, His parents had to move out of their house because Paul kept hitting his head on the ceiling and accidentally knocking the roof off. Imagine that for a second. You're a normal mom. You just wanted a normal baby. A little guy you could hold in your arms and sing lullabies to. And instead, you got a creature who drinks 40 gallons of milk for breakfast and uses your bed as a toothpick. His poor mother. There's an old story, probably made up, but I like it. That says Mrs. Bunyan used to rock Paul to sleep by sitting in a rocking chair while standing on top of a hill, because normal rocking chairs just snapped under the weight, and when Paul cried, the neighbors 2 valleys over would complain about the noise. That's the thing about being a giant. You don't get to be sad quietly. Your sadness is everyone's problem. He couldn't go to school because he didn't fit through the door. He couldn't play with other kids because he'd accidentally sit on them. Have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a tantrum? Now imagine that 2-year-old weighs as much as a freight train. One time, little Paul got upset because his breakfast wasn't ready fast enough. He stomped his foot. Just one stomp. That stomp created a hole so deep that water filled it up. They call that hole the Bay of Fundy today. You can look it up. I'm not joking. Well, I'm a little joking, but the story says that's how it happened. Paul didn't mean to break things, he really didn't. He was just big. Too big for a world that wasn't built for him. Sound familiar? Maybe you felt that way too. Not the giant part, the not fitting in part. Anyway, by the time Paul was 5 years old, he'd accidentally destroyed 3 villages, 2 bridges, and 1 very confused mountain. His parents finally sat him down, which took an hour because they had to climb up to his ear, and had the talk. "Paul, honey," his mother said, "we love you, but you have to leave." Ouch. Not because they didn't want him, because they couldn't feed him. Paul ate 300 pounds of potatoes for breakfast. He drank a river dry every afternoon just for a snack. His family was going bankrupt trying to keep him alive. So Paul left. He walked west, and when Paul Bunyan walks west, the ground shakes. Birds take off from trees a mile away. Deer run. Bears hide. The earth itself groans under his feet like it's saying, "Oh no, here he comes again." Paul walked across New York. Didn't even notice it. Step, step, step. Goodbye, Albany. He walked across Ohio. Some folks there thought an earthquake was happening. Nope, just a lonely giant looking for a place where he didn't have to duck. He kept going and going until he hit the territory that would eventually become Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the North Woods. Now, if you've never been to the North Woods in winter, let me paint you a picture. Imagine the coldest you've ever been. That time your car heater broke. That time you forgot your jacket. That time you stood outside for 10 minutes waiting for a bus in January. Multiply that by 100. Then add wind. Then add snow so deep it buries houses. Then add darkness that lasts for months because the sun is too lazy to show up. That's the North Woods. And Paul Bunyan looked at that frozen hellscape and said, "Perfect." Why? Because nobody else was there. He could be as big as he wanted. He could stomp. He could trip. He could accidentally swallow a lake. Nobody would care. For the first time in his life, Paul didn't have to apologize for existing. That feeling of finally finding a place where you belong, that's powerful. That's the kind of feeling that makes a person stay. So Paul stayed, not because he wanted to destroy the forest. He actually loved trees. But a giant's gotta eat, right? And the only job that paid enough to feed a giant was cutting down the biggest trees on earth. So Paul got an axe. Not a normal axe. Obviously, a normal axe would look like a toothpick in his hand. His axe was forged from the iron of a meteorite that fell somewhere over Montana. The handle was a whole oak tree. The blade was so sharp that just looking at it wrong would cut you. Paul called his axe Lucy. Nobody knows why. Maybe he was lonely, and naming his tools felt better than talking to himself. He started cutting. And let me tell you, when Paul Bunyan cuts a tree, he doesn't mess around. He'd swing that axe once, and 100 trees would fall. Crack, 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 like dominoes made of wood. He cleared entire forests in a single afternoon. But here's the thing about cutting down that many trees. You have to do something with them. You can't just leave them lying around. That's wasteful. And Paul, despite his size, was not wasteful. So he stacked them and stacked them and stacked them until the stacks of logs reached the clouds. They called those stacks mountains later. Some of them are still there. The Rockies, maybe. Or the Appalachians. Depends on who you ask. Paul didn't care what they called them. He just liked the rhythm of the work. Chop, stack, chop, stack. It kept his hands busy, kept his mind quiet. I mean, wouldn't you be? You're 100 feet tall. Your hands are the size of cars. Your voice sounds like thunder. You haven't had a real conversation with anyone in years because every time you open your mouth, people run away screaming. Paul tried talking to animals. That didn't work. Squirrels don't make great conversationalists. Bears just growl and run. Moose are actually pretty dumb, if we're being honest. He tried talking to the trees. The trees didn't answer. Obviously, but sometimes, when the wind blew through their branches, Paul pretended they were whispering back. You're doing good, Paul. We like you, Paul. Don't be sad, big guy. Pathetic? Maybe. But when you're that alone, you take what you can get. Then one day, and this is where the story changes, Paul found something in the snow. He was walking through a frozen valley, just minding his own business, when he heard a sound, a little sound, a squeaky, sad, shivering sound. Not a cow, moo, a different kind of moo, smaller, weirder. Paul looked down. Buried in a snowdrift up to his knees was a baby ox, a little calf, blue as a winter sky, shivering so hard its teeth were chattering. Now, Paul had no idea what a blue ox was. Nobody did, because blue oxen don't exist in nature. This thing was an accident, a freak, a tiny blue mutant that probably fell off a wagon somewhere and got left behind. But Paul looked at that little blue calf, shivering and alone in the snow, and he saw himself. Hey there, little buddy, Paul whispered. His voice, which usually shook mountains, came out soft, gentle, almost human. The calf looked up at him with big, watery eyes. And that was it. Paul scooped up the calf. It fit in the palm of his hand, that's how small it was, and tucked it inside his shirt to keep it warm. He named the calf Babe. Not original, but Paul wasn't trying to be original. He was trying not to be alone anymore. I mean, really fast. One week, Babe fit in Paul's pocket. The next week, Babe was the size of a dog. The week after that, the size of a horse. By the end of the first winter, Babe was the size of a barn. And blue, still blue. Bright, ridiculous, impossible blue. Paul didn't question it. When you're a giant who accidentally creates bays and mountains, you don't get to question weird colors. You just accept it and move on. Babe followed Paul everywhere. To the logging sites, to the rivers, to the frozen lakes where Paul would break the ice just to get a drink. They became a team. Paul would swing his axe, Babe would drag the logs. And I'm not talking about dragging 1 or 2 logs. I'm talking about dragging hundreds at a time. Babe was strong enough to pull entire forests behind him like they were nothing. People started hearing about them. The giant and his blue ox, loggers from all over, normal-sized men with normal-sized axes, started showing up at Paul's camp. They wanted to work for him. They wanted to see the legend with their own eyes. Paul was confused at first. You want to work with me, but I'm me. The loggers didn't care. They saw a guy, okay, a giant, who worked harder than anyone, who never quit, who treated his ox like family. They built a camp, then a bigger camp, then a camp so big it had its own post office, its own barber shop, its own saloon, where the loggers would drink bad whiskey and tell stories about Paul that got bigger every time they were told. I saw Paul lift a mountain with one hand. I saw Babe drink a river dry in 3 gulps. I saw Paul's axe blade cut a cloud in half. None of that was true, but it didn't matter. The men loved Paul. And for the first time in his life, Paul felt like he belonged somewhere. But here's the thing about belonging. It doesn't last. Winter came again, but not a normal winter. This was the winter of the blue snow. The winter so cold that words froze in mid-air. The winter so deep that birds fell from the sky with icicles hanging off their beaks. Paul had never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else. The loggers huddled around fires that barely gave off heat. The food ran out. The whiskey froze solid in the bottles. Men started getting sick. Some died. Paul tried everything. He built bigger fires. He hunted for food, which meant walking for days to find animals that hadn't frozen to death. He even tried breathing warm air onto the camp, but his breath just turned into fog and drifted away. Babe was suffering too. The blue ox's coat, which usually kept him warm, wasn't enough. He shivered. He moaned. He pressed his huge body against Paul's leg, trying to steal whatever warmth he could. And Paul, big, strong, unstoppable. Paul felt helpless for the first time since he was a child. I can't save them, he whispered to Babe one night. I can't save anyone. Babe licked his hand. That was all he could do. Maybe it was the cold, maybe it was the hunger, maybe it was just the weight of being the one everyone looked to for answers when he didn't have any. Paul grabbed his axe. He walked away from the camp, walked through the snow, walked until he couldn't hear the coughing of the sick men or the crying of the scared ones. He stood on the edge of a canyon, a little one, just a crack in the earth, and he screamed. Not a sad scream, a furious scream. The kind of scream that comes from a place so deep inside you that you didn't even know it existed. Then he swung his axe. One swing. Crack. The axe bit into the earth, and the earth opened. A crack spread out from the blade, wider and wider, deeper and deeper, until the little canyon wasn't little anymore. Water rushed in, melted snow, underground springs, maybe even the ocean itself. Nobody really knows. The canyon filled up with water so fast that Paul had to jump back to keep from getting washed away. He stood there, breathing hard, his giant chest heaving, and watched the water settle. The Grand Canyon, that's what they'd call it someday. One of the 7 natural wonders of the world, a place so beautiful that millions of people would travel thousands of miles just to stare at it. And it was born from a temper tantrum, from a giant who was tired, from a giant who was scared, from a giant who loved his people and couldn't save them and had nowhere to put all that grief except into the ground. Paul looked at what he'd done, then he sat down in the snow, crunch, and put his head in his hands. He didn't feel better, he felt worse, because the canyon wasn't going to feed his men, the water wasn't going to warm them. He just made a mess, a big, beautiful, useless mess. And somewhere behind him in the frozen camp, Babe let out a low, mournful moo that echoed across the snow. I know, that's a rough place to stop. But here's the thing about Paul Bunyan. The winter isn't over. The men are still dying. Babe is still shivering. And Paul, poor giant lonely Paul, is about to make a decision that changes everything. A decision that will make him a legend. A decision that will also destroy him. We'll get to that in part 2. The weird stuff. The tragic stuff. The ending they don't teach you in school, where Paul Bunyan doesn't ride off into the sunset. He just walks away. But that's for later. For now, close your eyes again. Hear the wind, hear the snow. Hear a giant man sitting by a canyon he didn't mean to make, wondering if he'll ever feel warm again. And maybe, just maybe, be grateful that your problems fit inside a house. You made it back. I was wondering if you would. Last time, we left Paul Bunyan sitting by a hole he'd chopped into the earth, colder than he'd ever been, watching his people freeze to death one by one. A giant who could move mountains but couldn't warm a single sick logger's hands. That's the thing about being strong, America. Sometimes you're strong enough to break the world, but you're never strong enough to fix the small stuff, like a fever, like a frozen lung, like watching someone you love turn blue, and not the good kind of blue like Babe, the bad kind, the kind that doesn't get up again. Tonight, we finish the story. Tonight, we talk about what Paul Bunyan did next, the miracle, the mistake, and the slow, quiet vanishing of the biggest man who ever lived, 020, 030, the invitation. So get comfortable. Pull those blankets up to your chin. If you have a pet nearby, give him a little scratch behind the ears. We're going deep into the frozen woods again, and I promise you, by the end of this, You will never look at a blue ox the same way again. Ready? Good. Let's find out what happened to Paul. Hey, welcome back. You know, when I was a kid, I had a picture book about Paul Bunyan. Big, colorful illustrations. Paul smiling. Babe looking like a giant stuffed animal. Every page ended with everyone laughing and eating pancakes. That book lied to me. Not because the author was mean, but because the real story, the one loggers told each other around fires so cold the flames looked sad, wasn't fit for a picture book. The real story starts with a fever. You remember the winter of the blue snow from part 1? Well, imagine that winter lasting 3 years. That's what happened. 3 years of snow, 3 years of dark, 3 years of men huddling in bunkhouses, coughing up things they shouldn't be coughing up, dying in their sleep, and being buried under drifts so deep that Paul couldn't even find their graves come spring. Because spring didn't come. Not for 3 years. Paul tried everything. He built fires so big they melted the snow for a mile in every direction. But the fires ate all the wood, and without wood the men couldn't build shelter, and without shelter they froze anyway. He tried hunting, walked for days, came back with meat, but there were too many mouths and not enough animals. The forest had gone quiet. Even the wolves had given up and died. He tried sending men south. Go, he told them, find warmth, find food, bring help. They went. They didn't come back. The snow swallowed them whole. Just. And Paul sat in the middle of his dying camp, holding his blue ox for warmth, and wondered if this was punishment. For what? For being born too big? For existing in a world that couldn't hold him? He didn't know, but he knew one thing. He had to do something, even if that something was stupid, even if that something made everything worse. He couldn't just sit there and watch everyone die. He decided to fight the winter. Not metaphorically, literally. He decided he was going to grab winter by the throat and squeeze until it let go of his people. Now, how does a giant fight a season? That's a good question, and the answer is not well. Paul stood up. He looked north, where the cold came from, and he started walking. Babe followed. Of course Babe followed. That ox would follow Paul into hell if Paul asked. And honestly, that's basically what he was doing. They walked for days. The snow got deeper. The wind got meaner. Paul's beard froze solid. His eyebrows turned into icicles. His fingers, each one the size of a small tree, went numb. But he kept walking. Babe kept walking, and eventually they found it. The source of the cold. I'm warning you, the story gets strange here, because loggers in the 1800s weren't exactly scientists. They were tired, cold, half-drunk men who saw things in the snow that probably weren't there. But they all agreed on one thing. At the heart of the winter, at the coldest point on earth, there was a mountain. Not a normal mountain. This mountain was made of ice. Clear ice, like glass. And inside the ice, frozen solid like a mosquito in amber, was a face. The face of a giant woman. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't waiting to be woken up. She was just there. There. Trapped. Her eyes open, her mouth open, like she'd been screaming when the ice grabbed her and never got the chance to stop. Paul stopped walking. Babe stopped walking. They stood there, steam rising from their nostrils, and stared at the frozen woman in the ice mountain. Paul didn't know who she was. Neither did Babe. But something in Paul's giant bones recognized her, like a memory he'd never lived, like a dream he'd forgotten the moment he opened his eyes. He reached out his hand, his big, cold, numb hand, and touched the ice. And the ice shattered. That's the thing about breaking something that was holding everything together. It doesn't fix things. It makes a mess. The ice mountain exploded. Chunks of frozen glass flew everywhere. One chunk, the size of a house, nearly took Babe's head off. Another chunk carved a hole in the ground so deep that water rushed in and became a lake. They call it Lake Superior now. And the woman, the frozen woman, she fell out of the ice, crashed onto the snow, lay there like a fallen statue, cracked and broken and impossibly still. Paul knelt down. His knees hit the ground so hard that the earth shook for 100 miles. People in what would someday be Chicago felt their plates rattle. He looked at her face. She was beautiful, not the kind of beautiful that makes you blush, the kind of beautiful that makes you sad because you know you'll never see anything like it again. Her eyes were closed now. The ice had kept them open for centuries, but without the ice, they'd finally gotten to rest. Paul didn't cry. Giants don't cry. Or maybe they do, and the tears just freeze before anyone sees them. He sat there for a long time. Babe sat next to him making soft, worried sounds. And then, slowly, like honey pouring uphill, the winter started to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not in a dramatic Hollywood way, but the sun came out. The wind stopped screaming. The temperature climbed from instant death to miserably cold to, hey, I can feel my toes. Paul's men stumbled out of their bunkhouses, blinking like moles, and saw green for the first time in 3 years. They cheered, they cried, they hugged each other and danced and sang songs that made no sense but felt wonderful anyway. And Paul watched them from a distance. He was still kneeling by the broken woman. The ice around her was melting, turning into a stream that flowed south, carving a river as it went. The Mississippi, maybe, or the Missouri. Depends on who tells the story. Who was she? Babe seemed to ask. Babe couldn't talk, obviously, but Paul had known him so long that he could read the ox's expressions, the tilt of the head, the flick of the ear. I don't know, Paul said, but he was lying. He knew. She was his mother. I know what you're thinking. His mother? But his mother was a normal-sized woman who lived in Maine and rocked him on a hill. Yeah, that's what the stories say. But stories change. Stories get edited. Stories leave out the parts that hurt too much to remember. Here's what Paul never told anyone. His real mother, not the nice lady who raised him in Maine, but his real mother was a giant too, a giantess who lived in the frozen north before humans even had names for north. She was old, ancient, older than the mountains, older than the ice itself, and she made a mistake. she fell in love with a human man, a normal-sized logger who wandered too far north and got lost. She found him freezing in the snow, took him into her cave, warmed him by her fire, and, well, you know how these stories go. They had a baby boy. A boy who was half giant, half human, too big for his mother's world, too strange for his father's. The human father took the baby and ran south, ran away from the frozen north, away from the giantess who loved him, away from the life they could have had together. He left her there, alone, in the cold. And the cold that had always been her friend, her blanket, her home, turned on her. It wrapped around her like a jealous lover, squeezed her, froze her, turned her into a statue inside a mountain of ice. She'd been there ever since, waiting for her son to come find her. And he did. 1,000 years later. Too late. Always too late. What would he say? Hey guys, good news, the winter is over. Bad news, I just found my mom's frozen corpse and shattered her into 1,000,000 pieces. No, he buried her instead, or tried to. He dug a hole with his bare hands, a hole so deep that he hit the hot part of the earth, the magma, the stuff that glows, and he placed her body inside. Then he covered her up. The mound of dirt and rock he left behind became a mountain. The loggers called it Mount Katahdin. It's in Maine. You can visit it. Or you can visit the canyon he made when he was angry, or the lake he made when he was sad, or the river he made when he was just trying to go home. That's the thing about Paul Bunyan. The whole continent is covered in his mistakes, and we call them landmarks. Neither was Babe. The blue ox had changed during that long walk through the frozen north. His fur was darker now, almost purple, and his eyes, his big, dumb, loving eyes, looked older, tired, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. The logging camp recovered, new men came, new stories spread. Paul Bunyan, the greatest lumberjack who ever lived. Paul Bunyan, who could chop down a forest before breakfast. Paul Bunyan, who had a blue ox the size of a barn. They built statues of him, not real statues, wooden ones, carvings, things the men made during long winter nights when there was nothing else to do. Paul didn't like the statues. They made him look happy. He wasn't happy, he was just going through the motions. Wake up, swing the axe, eat, sleep, wake up, swing the axe, eat, sleep, repeat, repeat, repeat. Babe stayed by his side, always. Even when Paul got quiet for days at a time, even when Paul forgot to eat, even when Paul stared at the northern horizon for so long that the sun went down and came back up and went down again. Babe stayed. Because that's what Babe did. No drama, no battle, no frozen mother rising from the ice for a final goodbye. Paul just got tired. Not sleepy tired, done tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes you wonder why you're still standing. He'd been alive for a long time, longer than anyone knew, longer than he'd ever admit. He'd seen forests grow and get cut down and grow again. He'd seen rivers change course. He'd seen mountains erode into hills. He'd seen everyone he ever loved die. The loggers from the early days? Gone. All of them. Buried under the trees they'd chopped down, probably. The men who carved the statues? Gone too. Their grandchildren were old now. Their great-grandchildren didn't even believe Paul was real. He was a legend, not a person. And that's a lonely thing to be. One morning, a normal morning, with normal snow and a normal grey sky. Paul walked away from the camp. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't leave a note. He just walked. Babe followed, through forests that Paul had planted himself, back when he was trying to make up for all the trees he cut down, through valleys that bore the shape of his footprints, past lakes that were really just puddles he'd left behind after a heavy rain. They walked until the trees got smaller and the sky got bigger and the ground turned to dust. The desert. Paul had never seen the desert before. He didn't like it. Too dry, too bright, too empty. But he kept walking. Babe kept walking. And eventually, after weeks, maybe months, maybe years, they reached the edge of the continent, the ocean, big and grey and cold and endless. Paul stood at the shore. The waves lapped at his ankles. Seagulls circled his head, confused by the giant thing that had appeared in their territory. Babe stood next to him. The ox's sides were heaving. He was old now, really old. His blue fur had gone grey at the edges. His eyes were clouded. Paul looked at the ocean, then he looked at Babe. "I think this is it, buddy," he said. Babe mooed softly. Not a sad moo, just a tired one. Paul sat down in the sand. The ground shook. A small wave washed over his boots. He didn't care. He put his arm around Babe's neck. The ox leaned into him, heavy and warm, and they sat there, together, at the edge of the world. Some people say Paul and Babe walked into the ocean and kept walking. Walked all the way to the bottom, where the pressure is so high that even a giant would feel small. And they're still down there, walking, looking for a place that feels like home. Some people say they turned into mountains, 2 mountains side by side, one big and one a little smaller. You can see them if you fly over Alaska, or maybe Canada, somewhere cold anyway. Some people say they're still in the North Woods, that if you go deep enough into the forest on the coldest night of the year, you can hear footsteps. Thump, 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 thump. And if you listen close, you can hear a low moo echoing through the trees like a foghorn. Here's what I think. I think Paul Bunyan got exactly what he wanted. Not fame, not statues, not stories that got bigger every time someone told them. He wanted to stop being the main character. He wanted to be small. He wanted to walk away and never have to explain himself. And that's what he did. He walked away. And the world kept spinning. The trees kept growing. The loggers kept telling stories that got less true with every telling. But somewhere out there, in the frozen north at the bottom of the ocean, in the space between a bedtime story and a dream, a giant and his blue ox are still walking, still looking, still hoping that the next valley, the next mountain, the next frozen lake might be the one where they finally belong. Not a hero, not a villain, just a big, tired, lonely guy who accidentally made a few canyons and couldn't save the people he loved. There's no moral to this story, no lesson, no happy ending, just a blue ox and the giant walking into the dark, leaving footprints that look like mountains. So the next time you're driving through the Grand Canyon, or sailing across Lake Superior, or freezing your butt off in Minnesota, think of Paul. Think of his frozen mother screaming inside a mountain of ice. Think of his loggers dying one by one while he stood there helpless. Think of Babe, good, loyal, ridiculous Babe, who never once thought about leaving. And think about what it means to be so big that the whole world is your body, and so small that nobody ever really knew you at all. Close your eyes now. It's late. You've been on a journey. Listen to the wind outside your window. Is it just wind, or is it the last echo of a giant's footsteps fading into the snow? Time to sleep. Time to dream. Time to let Paul Bunyan walk himself off the edge of your mind, one slow step at a time. Good night, America. Babe says good night too. Moo.